Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Las Vegas GP post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this race? Did you enjoy this race? Did the push for the McLaren drivers, and especially Lando, getting past in that first stint and trying to get back into that second or even first positions, keep you excited? What about Oscar, coming back from the back, working his way up and possibly getting, fourth or third due to his pit strategies? Did that, keep you interested in this running? Getting that title battle, clinched up closer, than it could have been? Or was, Kimmy's, one-stop pit stop way early on lap 2, exciting in the sense that he was able to run so smoothly and so energetically and get all the way up into that third position? With Russell, losing ground, did that help you out? Did that hurt you? Did Max is, basically taking the lead and then kind of getting that gap, bigger and bigger as that race went on? The normal situation that we see with Max Verstappen and that Red Bull, did that, make it dull? It's like, oh, Max is in the lead. We're basically having a dull race from that point forward. Was it dull because we expected more passing during this race, as it was all built up as like, oh yeah, we have the most passing, situations in the season, and of course, we were looking at it. It didn't have quite as many passes. I mean, it had a few passes, but not quite as many as they kind of built it up to be. What about the McLaren disqualification? Did that shock you? It definitely did shock me. I mean, I watched the race and then I came back, a little bit later and like, what? They were disqualified, and how did that, affect all of the running? And did that really put a downer on things, because the race you just watched kind of was irrelevant, as you had Max in the lead and you had the McLaren drivers out, and so that puts the championship more in Max's hands. He hasn't quite won it yet, but it has that connotation, and with Max anything's possible. So how is that going to play out in the next two races, and the sprint race? Is he going to clinch it? Is he going to come back? Or are the McLaren drivers going to pull forward and solidify and be able to haul out that drivers' championship as well, and keep Max behind them? I mean, that was kind of an interesting situation for that in that running. Did you think Max was going to be able to pull out the second position for the constructors standings in the next few races? Is he going to have that in many points to be able to pull that out and get ahead of the Mercedes, and push back all of the Ferraris and Mercedes drivers back down the pack into that running, and basically single-handedly give Red Bull that second constructor standings? Is that possible? Do you think that's even something that can be done, or is that something that's we should just kind of keep on the sidelines? All of these things are kind of interesting aspects that kind of occurred from this race and the disqualifications because of the McLarens. With that plank wear, aspect and disqualification that kind of threw out those standings, and so now they are still in the lead, but they're back on the points margins again, and so they're going to have to be playing a lot more offensive, defensive against Max in that regard, keeping themselves out of trouble, but still trying to stay ahead of Max. A little bit more intense than it has been in the past. So is that going to make the next few races more exciting? Or is this going to be dulling out because we think Max has the advantage at this point in time? Anyway, I will get to all of the drivers in this series, in this race, and how well they did and what happened to them, if I know what happened to them, just like normal. So without further ado, we will start off with Oscar Piastri, who is in that 20th position. He started off in 5th and ended up in that 20th position with a disqualification. He did lose 2 spots in the very first lap, so not the greatest start from him in that running. He did have a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 21, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. That pit stop was in a 2.7 second pit stop, so it's a little bit slow for him as well. He did pass Lawson for 6th on lap 2, passed Hijar for 6th on lap 16, passed Sainz for 9th on lap 23, and of course was disqualified because of that plank wear at the end. Now, this was kind of a mixed bag in relationship for him, because he was having that, it was a poor start with that qualifying session, and then he kind of ended up where he was, losing some positions, at the very start of this race. And so we're thinking things were going to go bad, but then he had a good strategy in that pit stop, which jumped him over a few positions and able to get back up into the running, fighting for that fourth and that third position, closing that gap up enough for us to think that, oh yes, he still has a shot in this, race, getting those point margins. Yes, he's still losing points, but not quite as much as that we would have thought at the beginning of this race. But of course, now all that's just kind of thrown out the window with that disqualification. So all that gap is dropping down significantly. And the same kind of thing is with Lando Norris, who started off in first and ended up in 19th with that disqualification as well for that same issue with the plank wear. He did lose 2 spots at the very first lap, like Oscar, his teammate, but this time it was more his own fault in that regard. So it's not a good start, even though I applaud his rationale and his ability to try to, focus in on keeping that position from Max. It ended up kind of backfiring and letting Max and Russell by as he did that hard chop on Max to keep him behind, but then of course missed his braking position, so he ended up going wide, letting Max go by, and eventually, Russell went by as well during that stint because of him going wide. So that was kind of all his fault, and he kind of messed that up, as we heard in the exit interview for him. He did pass Russell again later for that second position on lap 34. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 22, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, and that was a 2.5 second pit stop. So a little bit better than his teammate, but still kind of a little bit slower than what we expect to see in this F1 series. He also had a fuel issue at the very end of this race, which hurt us in that running because he was really going to push forward towards Max. And at the end, where he just ended up having to back off significantly and save some issues because apparently he was running out of fuel. So there's some miscalculation on the team on that regard as well, on how well that worked. And so that kind of hurt him in the end. He still ended up getting that second position, finishing in the race, but then of course was disqualified because of that plank wear, which drops things out, makes the next few races potentially very interesting or very boring, depending on how well Max does comparatively. Because Lando is still in the lead, but with Max, biting at the heels, and the way Max is kind of coming back at the end of the season, there's no telling how bad that could be for the McLaren drivers. Lance Stroll started off in 12th and ended up in 18th with a DNF. He got hit by Borletto, with a dive bomb into turn 1, lap 1, knocking him out of this race quite early on, where he ended up having to stop on track around turn 5 on that first lap. So he didn't make it very far, and unfortunately for him, the Aston Martins looked decent. They weren't, super great, but they looked decent, so they were able to potentially fight for some of those bottom points, which didn't turn out to be the case, as he got knocked out in this running straight off the bat. And, Borletto, admitted that in his interview as well, saying he was completely sorry for that, misjudged that, and just missed his breaking point way long and just collided with Stroll. Gabriel Borletto started off in 18th and ended up in 17th with a DNF himself after dive bombing, into that turn 1, lap 1 scenario and hitting Stroll and damaging his car enough where he had to stop basically a lap later to just retire that stake F1 car. So unfortunately for him, he kind of knocked himself out for the second week in a row in this running. So it made it really hard for him. So hopefully he can get his mojo back in the next couple of races and end on a strong note, as he was looking fairly good in the second part of the season, coming back and being more competitive against his teammate. So hopefully that'll continue on the next couple of races and he can end on a high. Alexander Albon started off in 16th and ended up in 16th with a DNF. He gained one position at the very first start of that first lap. So a decent start for him, not a super start, but a decent start, gaining that one position. He ran into the back of Franco Colapinto on the start as well, and I believe that's where he got his 5-second penalty for causing a collision. He also ended up having a little bit of contact with Hamilton as well a little bit later on, around that time, when that penalty was given. So I think it was more to the front one than the second one, but I'm not clear on that. He did a two-stop strategy due to that contact, stopping on lap 13, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums with a 3.9 second pit stop, so that's pretty long. And then he stopped again on lap 14, so just a lap later with an 11.3 second pit stop. He did pass Lawson for 14th on lap 2, passed Hamilton for 12th on lap 12, hit Hamilton in some of those back and forth maneuvers, knocking his front right end plate off, which then eventually caused the second virtual safety car with that debris on the track. He passed Franco Colapinto for 16th on lap 32, and he eventually retired his car on lap 37. I also heard that he did not have any team radio for the whole race, and so that kind of mixed things up a little bit for him, trying to figure out when to come in and what damages was on that car and everything else. And so I'm sure that played a role into him retiring that vehicle. This gets us to Franco Colapinto, who started off in 15th and ended up in 15th. He did lose one spot at the very first lap, so not the greatest start for him. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 25, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums, and had a 4-second pit stop, so pretty slow overall. He did pass Lawson for 15th on lap 2 when Lawson had that front wing damage, and it was kind of slower around the track. Other than that, he kind of stayed out of the way, didn't have a lot of action in this, so I'm not sure exactly how well his race was going overall. So I didn't get to see a whole lot of him. Liam Lawson started off in 6th and ended up in 14th. He had a two-stop strategy, stopping on lap 2, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, and then taking that set of hards to lap 28 before switching to a second set of hards. And that second pit stop was a 2.4 second pit stop, so a decent pit stop for him. He had that front wing damage. I believe it was because when he hit Oscar in that turn 1, lap 1 incident, and then weakened it enough so that by lap 2, it started falling off, and that was caused him issues because it was past that pit stop entrance, and so then he had to go around the whole track with that broken wing that caused him to drop back into the field. He did pass Franco Colapinto for 16th on lap 40. Pierre Gasly started off in 10th and ended up in 13th. He lost 8 spots at the very first lap, mainly because he got hit and got spun around. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 2, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, and taking that set of hards the rest of the way. So we have one other driver, Kimi, that did that, and kind of it paid off for Kimi. Unfortunately, it didn't quite pay off for Gasly in this run. He did get hit by Stroll after Bortoleto hit him, spinning Gasly around and making him basically lose those 8 positions on the very first lap, which he was never able to really regain those spots or those positions in this run. Yuki Tsunoda started from the pit. He started from the 20th position and ended up in 14th. He did gain 3 spots at the very first lap, so a pretty good run for him. He did a 2-stop strategy, stopping on lap 1, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, taking that set of hards to lap 27 before switching to a set of mediums. And that second pit stop was a 2.2 second pit stop, so a pretty good run from him. Other than that, he was kind of quiet, didn't get a lot of action, but just kind of stayed out of the way of all the other drivers, keeping clear, keeping himself going, and taking it through that through the strategy of the pit stops, getting him up into that 14th position. So if he could get his qualifying better, it would help him out quite a bit. And with Max being in the lead, that kind of hurts the look of everything. So we'll have to see how well that plays out the rest of the season, and how well, if he actually makes keeps that Red Bull position, or gets dropped to the Racing Bulls, or he gets dropped entirely. So there's a lot of pressure on Yuki, which probably doesn't help in these situations either. Fernando Alonso started off in 7th and ended up in 11th. He lost 3 spots at the very first lap. I know heard him on complaining, I think more about Bortoleto as he was going through and kind of rammed into the side and all the chaos that happened. And then, of course, he was saying that, but he's out of the race, and so he's not going to get penalized in that front in that regard. So there's some of that issues there going on. I think it made him lose those 3 positions in that run that kind of put him behind a little bit where he was wanting to be. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 16, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Lawson for 9th on lap 2, passed Yuki for 13th on lap 22, and passed Franco for 12th on lap 22 as well. So he passed Yuki on the beginning of the lap and then passed Franco at the end of the lap. and then basically stayed in that kind of rough estimate to the end, where the different strategies kind of played in, dropping him back down into that 11th position. This gets us to our top 10, where we find both Haas's. We first find Oliver Bearman, who started off in 14th and ended up in 10th. He gained 6 positions in the very first lap, so he had a really good start in that run, and somehow lost a few of those in the mix due to some issues with his tires and how well they were working in this situation on the slick road. He didn't quite like that so much in general. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 17, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, and that was a 3.1 second pit stop. He did pass Lawson for 7th on lap 2, passed Yuki for 14th on lap 24, passed Franco for 13th on lap 24, passed Alonso for 11th on lap 32, getting him up into that points positions in that running right at the edge, and then of course with the McLaren drivers dropping out, pushing him up into that very last point position. So that gives Haas the extra point, which helps them out in the constructors' standings. Esteban Ocon started off in 13th and ended up in 9th. He gained 1 position on the very first lap, so a decent start from him. Did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 27, so a little bit later than his teammate, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a nice 3.2 second pit stop. He did pass Lawson for 11th on lap 2, passed Alonso for 12th on lap 33, and then passed his teammate Bearman for 11th on lap 34. And then, of course, again, with the McLaren drivers dropping out, pushed him up into that 9th position, getting some decent points for that Haas team. In that 8th position, we find Lewis Hamilton, who started off in 19th and ended up in 8th. He gained 6 positions on the very first lap because of that chaos that was on that first lap that was happening. And he did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 29, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums. And that pit stop was 3.0 seconds. Passing Lawson for 12th on lap 2, passed Albon for 12th on lap 13, passed Ocon for 9th on lap 20. So Lewis Hamilton did, I think, a pretty good job getting him back from the back of the pack up to the front, even though he had a horrible qualifying session. It kind of helped him pay off a little bit and helped the Ferraris a little bit more, getting them up into that 8th position, getting some okay points. I know it's not where he wants to be, fighting for the front, but I think he's doing a decent job in the race. He just needs to get the qualifying session together so that he can, take advantage of that positions and really play out in that qualifying session when the Ferrari's doing decently, like in the dry and not the wet that it was in with that qualifying session, dropping him back down to that 19th position. So we'll have to see if those next 2 races in the dry areas in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar will help out in that regard. Nico Hülkenberg started off in 11th and ended up in 7th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 30, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums. He did pass Lawson for 10th on lap 2 and passed Bearman for 8th on lap 17. So Nico is coming out doing fairly well in that Sauber car, that Kick Sauber F1 team, where we didn't quite expect at the end of the season. We figured they would be at the back of the pack. Instead, they're still going up there and getting some extra points for them in this running. So that's good to see. I think he did a really good job in that, showing off his experience and how to, get the most out of that car. Then we come to Isaac Hydjar, who started off in 8th and ended up in 6th. He gained 3 spots at the very first lap and had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 20, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, and had a nice 2.9 second pit stop in that running. And then kind of the strategy played out from there, getting them up into that 6th position for the final. So I think he did a good job of maintaining that, keeping clear of all the chaos that was going on around him at the very beginning, and just maintaining his own race in that running and getting him up into those decent points for those Racing Bulls in that scenario. So unlike his teammate that kind of got caught up in some of the issues and have some issues, he was able to keep it clean, and it shows off at the end of the race. Carlos Sainz started off in 3rd and ended up in 5th. He lost a 1 spot at the very first lap, so not the greatest start, but with that Williams car in that mix there as well, it's hard to expect them to stay into that 3rd position with the Ferraris the Mercedes and the McLarens around him with the Red Bull as well. So in that regard, I think he did a decent job of maintaining losing one position. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 22, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a 2.6 second pit stop. So a pretty good pit stop for him. And then, of course, as I said, just keeping it up there, keeping it clean. Again, I think he did a good job in that qualifying session that got him into that position. And then he was able to, maintain that for the most part without any too much issues, getting up into that fifth position where he could get some decent points again for Williams in this run. I know it's not quite where he wants to be in the, fighting for the podiums, but hopefully that'll come out next year when he have a little bit more, say in how that car is being built and working out as he's gotten used to that Williams car. Charles Leclerc started off in 9th and ended up in 4th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 24, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a 2.7 second pit stop. He did pass Lawson for 8th on lap 2, passed Behrman for 7th on lap 5, passed Oscar for 6th on lap 11, and passed Hijar for 5th on lap 13. I know he was really doing good in that Ferrari, as that Ferrari had a different setting configuration. I don't know what it was, but it did much better in the dry than it did in the wet, where he was able to work his way back up to the field and have the right, pit strategy to keep him up there and get him into that 4th position, where he was kind of fighting for that 3rd position, getting fairly close to Kimi in that run, but of course with all of that was not quite able to take advantage of that. But still a good run from Charles Leclerc in this scenario, getting up there, getting some good points. Kimi Antonelli started off in 17th and ended up in 3rd. He gained 3 spots at the reverse lap, so a really good start for him. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 2, switching from a set of softs to a set of hards, taking that set of hards to the rest of the way, which kind of shocked a few people, and maintaining it so well that he was still competitive at the end. So a really good job from Kimi in that front. Even though he did get a 5-second penalty for a false start where he was slightly rolling on that start line before it was running, I don't think he really felt it because it was really very slight. You could only kind of barely see it on the video when they redid that replay. He did pass Lawson for 13th on lap 2, passed Franco for 10th on lap 10, and passed Ocon for 7th on lap 25. So if it wasn't for that 5-second penalty, I think he may have been able to bump up in his teammate and get that 2nd position, but unfortunately he had that 5-second penalty, which kept him more into that 3rd position. His teammate, George Russell, started off in 4th and ended up in 2nd. He did gain 2 spots at the first lap, so he did a good start getting up there, getting into that 2nd position to start off with. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 17, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards with a nice 2.2 second pit stop, and he passed Hijar for 6th on lap 20. And he did put a lot of pressure on Max at the very beginning, trying to get into that run to see if he could work it out. And apparently he did the same thing when, Max pitted and he came out fairly close. He thought maybe he could get him on the cooler tires that Max had when he had a little bit warmer tires, and that kind of ruined his own tires. So he had to start really being more conservative on that. Wasn't sure if he could actually end the race on those set of tires, but he was still able to maintain that. But he kind of killed that momentum for that viewership and for him trying to potentially push for that 2nd position or that 1st position in that run. So unfortunately for him, he kind of made a mistake on the judgment of how well those tires would hold up in those kind of conditions and kind of ruined those tires in that running. So if he could have maintained those tires in the better circumstances, maybe he could have been a lot better push at the end, and we might have seen a little bit more of a battle at the end lap. But a decent run, I think. Still, he had the knowledge to not pull back and go for the podium position, for that 3rd position with Lando in the mix, and then of course gets bumped up to that 2nd position with Lando being disqualified. And then we come to our race winner, of course, Max Verstappen, who started off in 2nd and ended up in 1st. He gained that 1 spot at the very first lap, where Lando, was trying to hold him back, but ended up going wide, letting him by, and then he never kind of looked back as he just kind of ran away with it, keeping those gaps fairly constant and growing throughout this race. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 25, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, and had a 3-second pit stop, which is a little bit slow for the Red Bulls in that running. So that could have hurt him a little bit, but in the mix, it really didn't hurt him at all, as he had the gaps to handle that as well. And as I said, he was able to, do all of that because Lando did that really hard chop on him to keep him behind. But of course, Lando wasn't able to maintain that position because he, didn't brake in time. And so he went wide, letting Max by in that run. And we'll see that, as we come through the quick race review here. Oh, and he also got, of course, the driver of the day, which he very well deserved, as he was able to come in from that second position, dominate pretty much the race in that regard, not really having the pressure that he could have had from George Russell or Lando in that front, to get that first position back and then maintaining that position and really maintaining those tires throughout this race, knowing how to judge that, degradation on those tires. So he could push at the end where he ended up getting the fastest lap anyway. And so he had all three there. So he had, the fastest lap, the driver of the day, and that first position. So not quite the triple, crown for the qualifying and pole position, but still a really good run from Max Verstappen. And of course, for our nice quick race summary, we basically have that virtual safety car that came out on lap 2 and went to lap 4 due to some of that, debris that was on track and, Stroll's car and some other things that were going on in that mix, having to get it cleared in a orderly and safe manner. So that pulled out that virtual safety car early on. So by lap 5, Max had a 1.09 second lead over George Russell. By lap 10, it was up to a 1.25 second lead over George Russell. By lap 15, it was up to a 1.73 second lead over George Russell. And then, of course, we had that second virtual safety car that was only basically a lap. It came out on lap 16 and ended on lap 16. So by lap 25, Max had a 16.9 second lead over George Russell. And that was kind of a weird mix. Had a hard time gauging that particularly well, as that was the lap that Max came in for his pit stop. But it was still able to come out ahead of George Russell. So that timing may be a little bit off there. But anyway, it was quite a bit, of a gap there between him and George Russell, allowing him to do a pit stop in that mix and still come out in the lead. By lap 35, Max had a 4.96 second lead over, Lando as well. So we had that switch for that second position for Lando Norris, coming into that second position ahead of, George Russell, but was still, quite a bit behind Max Verstappen. By lap 45, it was a 5.94 second lead for Max over Lando. And of course, by the end on lap 50, it was a 20.54 second lead over Lando Norris. As Lando said, had that issue and was losing basically 4 seconds at least for each lap that was being run at the end. And so that kind of threw things off, for that gap, but it was still, able to maintain that is really strong for Max. So I threw some, these gap charts out here from, Multiview that we get for these aspects. And this is the one that's basically right as Max is going in for his pit stop. And we can kind of see, Lando, having that pit stop around lap 23. And we have, Leclerc already in the mix, already having, coming in for his pit stop on lap 25. And then, of course, we have some other ones in their mix as well, with the Mercedes coming through in that running with Kimi Antonelli and George Russell. And you can kind of see those gaps and how they played out in this running, which I thought was kind of interesting here in that running as Max was coming through, still out in the lead after his pit stop with George Russell in that mix in that run. And then we come to basically the fight for fourth this is around like flat 41, 42, but I thought this was kind of interesting for that fourth position battle there. You can kind of see, of course, Max out pretty far in the lead with Lando, big gap for Lando, and then, Kimi George Russell in the mix, and then Kimi Antonelli with that more solid, aqua line, in there with Oscar Piastri and Charles Leclerc. As you can see that gap really shrink in, as those laps were going by from lap, early on to the lap 30, mid 30s to then, the mid 40s, with that battle for that fourth position. I thought that was kind of an interesting view in this race. And of course, by the end, we had this huge gap for Max Verstappen, as Lando could not maintain that because of the fuel issues that he was having. So he could see that big, huge drop off for Lando in this running. And then, of course, you have Russell that came slowly maintaining that spot, but still having to, judge those tires and kind of go around fairly slowly, allowing, his teammate Kimi and, Oscar and Charles Leclerc coming up, again from those other positions, to try to fight for those last podium position in that run. So I think that was kind of the end result there with those gaps in that running. So kind of an interesting regard, I think, just kind of giving an overall picture of how that race was played out. So what did this do to our drivers' standings, our championship, where we still have Lando in the lead with 390 points and Oscar with 366 points. But of course, Max gained quite a bit, now tied with Oscar with 366 points. So I'll have to see how these next few races kind of lead, if he takes over that second position or even pushes up to that first position in these last few races. Of course, we have George Russell gaining some ground as well with 294, Charles Leclerc with 226. Now, the big changes here we see is Isaac Hydjar jumping over Nico Hülkenberg into that 9th position, now with 51 points, and Carlos Sainz jumping up to that 11th position with 48 points over Oliver Bearman and Fernando Alonso. We also see Esteban Ocon jumping over Stroll, now with 32 points in that tie mix. And for the constructor standings, of course, we had McLaren won in Singapore, but has 756 points, but didn't really gain anything with the disqualification. So we see Mercedes moving up to 431 points, with Red Bull with 391 points, so not too terribly far behind, and Ferrari with 378 points. So still a decent gap there, but still possible for those three to switch around for that second position. We see Williams gaining a little bit more points, solidifying that 5th position for them with 121 points. Haas jumping over Aston Martin now with 73 points over Aston Martin's 72. And what is coming up next? We have Qatar or La Salle in November 29th. And it is a sprint race weekend, so be watching out for that Saturday for that sprint race. The course has a length of 3.26 miles, and it'll have 19 laps being run for that sprint race for a total race distance of 973 miles. The lap record holder currently is Lando Norris with 1 minute 22.384 seconds, and it was first introduced in 2021. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.